Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Monday, February the 9th, 2026. Today there is a last quarter moon. In other words, the lunar cycle is coming to a close. Just over a week ago we had a full moon. In about a week's time we've got a new moon. And so, things are coming to an end, and of course this new moon will be the beginning of the Chinese New Year. So last quarter moon is a reminder that things are coming to an end, that perhaps it's time to wrap up this lunar cycle. If we haven't got it together now, then well, maybe we're going to have to wait until the new moon. So in this video I will be looking at this last quarter moon in some detail. But to begin with, I want to consider the astrology and the I Ching for today, which is Monday, February the 9th. So here is the chart for today, set for New York at noon. So as far as what is going on, we can see that the moon is in Scorpio. Still in Scorpio, in late Scorpio. So there's the moon at 22 degrees 54 to about 23 degrees Scorpio at noon New York time today, Monday. And that tells us, well, it tells us that the moon is out of a Via Combusta. So the Via Combusta part of the sky between 15 Libra, 15 Scorpio, the moon has left the Via Combusta. So in one sense, that might mean that things are sort of more straightforward, and the moon is making a trine to Jupiter, sort of beginning of the day. The moon is making a trine to Jupiter in Cancer, then it's moving towards a trine of Saturn. So remember, Saturn is about to go into Aries on, when is it, the end of the week? I think it's Saturday the 14th, Valentine's Day. Saturn moves into Aries. So you might argue that there is a bit of a grand trine going on. It's not an exact grand trine, but we've got these planets in water signs, moon in Scorpio, Jupiter in Cancer, Saturn in Pisces, and the moon is moving from a trine of Jupiter to a trine of Saturn. So that does mean that the emotional content may be more than it was a few days ago. Remember, we've got the moon in Scorpio, and as far as the water signs are concerned, we've also got we've now got Mercury in Pisces. Mercury is making good pace through Pisces. Mercury is now at 4 degrees Pisces. So the emotional content is very much there, and it is increasing. And you can see that Venus is at 29 degrees 6 minutes Aquarius. In other words, Venus is getting ready to move into Pisces. And so when Venus moves into Pisces, we're only going to have 3 planets left in Aquarius. So it's kind of interesting that we've got this sort of balance between Aquarius and Pisces at the moment. And Aquarius and Pisces are really very different signs. We've got an air sign and a water sign. We've got Aquarius, a sign ruled by Saturn, Pisces, a sign ruled by Jupiter. So there are big differences between Aquarius and Pisces, and we're perhaps experiencing both of them. So what is the link between Aquarius and Pisces? Do they have anything in common? Well, one thing they do have in common, if you look at things from a Jungian perspective, is that they are sort of on the rational axis, rather than the fire and the earth signs are regarded as being irrational. So what does one mean by rational? How are both the air signs and the water signs rational? Well, I think it is about how they make up their minds, how they come to conclusions, how they process their environment. And with the air signs, perhaps you use your mind to make decisions. You use your mind. With the water signs, you perhaps use your feelings. But both of them are inner processes. And when we talk about rationality, we probably shouldn't see it in terms of the modern concept of rationality. It's sort of more of a traditional philosophical idea about rationality. It's about us as sort of independent, thinking, feeling human beings using our intelligence to reach conclusions. We don't have to necessarily worry about what's going on externally. We don't have to look at the data. We can work it out for ourselves, whether it's through our feelings or through our intellect. Whereas if you're an earth sign, you are looking at things from on the outside. You're looking at the data. You're looking at surface appearances. Maybe if you're a fire sign, you maybe are linked up with, I don't know, some sort of external connectedness. But you could then argue that fire and earth are sort of more about the external world and how we relate to that external world, and we use what we perceive around us to make our decisions. Whereas water and air are just about having to reach our own conclusions, using our heart and using our mind. So that might be telling us something about how we navigate the world, or how other people are navigating the world. We navigate the world through our intellect and through our sensitivity, and it is an internal process, and that's why we might call it rational. I hope that makes some sense. So that's the main stuff going on. Mercury is making a semi-sextile to Pluto. So Mercury is at 4 degrees Pisces, and Pluto is at 4 degrees Aquarius. So there's a bit of a clash there between Mercury and Pluto. And so Mercury is, of course, in a water sign now, in Pisces, and it's trying to sort of feel its way through. And it's not always easy, because Mercury is aware of something else. So Mercury might have its own feelings and about what's happening, and it's not always easy. And Mercury is also aware that there is some huge force out there which is difficult to understand, but at the same time needs to be taken on board. And perhaps Mercury is having to deal with the challenges of the new, and perhaps that's what we all have to deal with, the challenges of something new, very modern. And we know that things have changed, and we know that it's a big change, and it's not a change that can easily be reversed. So that's the picture. If we set the chart for New York, if we set the chart for Sydney, Australia, Moon is still in Scorpio. That trine between the Moon and Jupiter is going to be stronger in Australia than in the Americas. It's going to be perhaps the major event of the day. And of course, Moon in Scorpio trine Jupiter in Cancer is by and large a pretty good aspect. It's quite an easygoing aspect. It's relatively lucky. We're in a position where we can make things happen in a gentle way. It doesn't take much to create fortunate change, and indeed we don't have to use too much effort. And if we feel good about something, I'm not in Australia, so if you're in Australia and you're able to pick up on this moon trine Jupiter, I think that you should have a certain amount of luck. And if you give something a go and you come at it with the right approach, there is a high chance of success. Then there is the heliocentric view, putting the sun at the center of the solar system. So here is the heliocentric chart. The Earth is at 20 degrees Leo, and Mercury is at 19 degrees Aries. So we have a heliocentric trine between the Earth and Mercury. So that trine does give a certain amount of ease, especially when it comes to how we communicate and how we think, and maybe we can look at the world in a different way, and perhaps engage our intellect. Maybe not just our intellect. Geocentrically, Mercury is in Pisces, so it could be that we have a chance to not just make sense of things, but maybe also realize what we have to do next. And if we want to talk and communicate our ideas, then heliocentrically, this aspect between Earth and Mercury should make it relatively easy. So that's the main thing going on today. I don't think there's a huge amount to report. I mean, in general, there's not a huge amount to report. Astrologically, things are quite light today, Monday. I mean, what is the main aspect? Well, there is a last quarter moon. I mean, I will be talking about the last quarter moon in detail at the end of the video, but with this last quarter moon, I think it just might feel that something is coming to an end. If we want to make something happen, well, we better do it now, because if we don't get it together today, Monday, well, time's flying. Before you know it, it'll be the new moon. And, this period, just before the Chinese New Year, some say it's a time when one really shouldn't be doing anything. One should be wrapping up the old year, and certainly not initiating any new projects. And that applies not just today, but perhaps probably certainly for the rest of the week. So now I want to turn to the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for today, which is Monday, February the 9th, 2026. Aries, you have powerful feelings. I mean, you always have powerful feelings, but maybe these feelings are sort of more powerful than usual, and they're not the kind of things that always easy to talk about. And this is not a typically Aries day. You feel that you have ideas, you have thoughts, you have feelings, but can you express it all? I think possibly not, and that just might be the way it is. And that doesn't mean that you're not able to get on with people. I think you can get on with people in a sort of easygoing, natural way, provided nothing is at stake. If it's just getting in touch with various people, developing particular contacts, that works well. But if you're trying to do anything of any substance, and other people are involved, I just don't think it's necessarily going to work. So I don't think that there's necessarily too much you have to do. And Aries, probably the best way of handling today would be to do things where you don't need any help, where you know how it works, no one else might know how it works, and if something needs to be kept secret, then that might be the right approach. And if you want to understand something, again, understand it in your own way, Aries, then I think you can. But there are just things that you believe cannot be discussed, and perhaps, Aries, you might kind of find yourself leading sort of two different lives. I mean, on the surface, for sure, as I've just said, you can come over as being friendly, reasonably warm. I wouldn't have said gushingly warm, but you can just appear to be your normal self, but deep down you know that things are happening, and you can just sort of perceive it. I mean, it's becoming obvious that something is happening. It may be that what's going on is that Mars, because Mars is your, of course, your ruler, that Mars is moving towards the middle of Aquarius, and Mars, middle of Aquarius, it will be making a semi-square to the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. Semi-squares, do have quite narrow orbs. I know that with aspects like trines and squares, you think of, I don't know, 8-degree orbs, massive orbs, but semi-squares, quadrates, they're a powerful aspect, but I like to use 1-degree orbs. But now Mars is within 1.5 degrees of making a semi-square to Saturn and a semi-square to Neptune. It's close enough to be picking up on it, and I think that that's probably what's going on, Aries. You can feel that something is becoming complicated, and it is more complicated than you'd realized, and there might be also a feeling of worry. You just don't quite know what's going on, and maybe you're still processing the fact that Neptune's just moved into Aries. So Neptune moved into Aries. Yeah, okay, it moved into Aries a bit of time ago. Was it the end of January? So it didn't just happen, but it's something you're still getting used to. Having this rather confusing planet moving through your star sign. Sorry, or it could be your star sign. It could be your ascending rising sign, or it could be your moon sign. Depends how you're looking at these horoscopes. And things aren't necessarily clear, and as Mars moves to the the semi-square of Neptune, that lack of clarity is becoming, increasingly obvious. And another thing about today, final thing about today, it is of course the last quarter moon. So we've got the Sun in Aquarius and the Moon in Scorpio. So Sun in Aquarius, that's great. Sun in Aquarius, from an Aries perspective, all these Aquarius planets, not just the Sun, it's about maybe your social life. It's about perhaps your hopes for the future, and it might have felt that things were going well. We had a new moon, last new moon. Actually, the last new moon was in Capricorn, and this was a time when you were perhaps aligning yourself to the challenges of 2026, and then the moon in Scorpio comes along and makes a square to the Sun in Aquarius. And so what that means is there's just something else you hadn't quite considered, and that's really what I've been talking about over the course of this piece on Aries, that things are more complicated, and indeed people are more complicated. Or they're more complicated than you had realized, and perhaps more complicated than you'd hoped for. And so that says something about your social life. Sure, you can deal with people on a sort of a fairly light and trivial level, but the moon square Sun, that's its last quarter moon, is reminding you that not everything is straightforward. Taurus. Venus is really right at the end of Aquarius now. It's had its last stop, if you like, and the next stop is in Pisces. So it really is in a process of change. It's almost neither one thing nor the other, but I wouldn't go that far, because I don't believe that cusps are a thing. In other words, there is a precise moment when Venus changes sign. Before that moment, Venus is in Aquarius. It has all the attributes of Aquarius. After that moment, it has all the attributes of Aries. There's no sort of halfway moment there with a planet changing sign. But in terms of what you do, what you plan for, you need to realize that something is coming to an end, and it is Venus. It is your ruler. So moving from sort of a Venus in Aquarius state to being in a Venus in Pisces state. I mean, that is certainly a big change. And so, if you found yourself, speculating, thinking, conceptualizing, with Venus in Aquarius, then how long is that going to go on for? Well, when Venus moves into Pisces, your approach, will be different. I think it will be more emotional, more sensitive, and maybe more fortunate, because you shouldn't forget that Venus is exalted in Pisces. So maybe while Venus is in Aquarius, these last hours perhaps of Venus being in Aquarius, you maybe have a chance to sort of wrap things up. Certain things need to be brought to a close, and that sort of links also with the fact that we've got a last quarter moon. This last quarter moon is about something coming to an end, and think particularly, if relevant, about your ambitions. What are you trying to achieve, and what are your plans for the future? And hopefully you have been thinking about these plans, and hopefully you had lots of really good ideas with Venus in Aquarius. But now it's making that transition. So that is an important change, and maybe you shouldn't be committing yourself to anything right now. You need to wait for Venus to make the change, to make the sign change. Now, as far as other people are concerned, the moon is still in Scorpio. Scorpio is, of course, your opposite sign, and Scorpio is a sign in the Taurean horoscope that is often connected with relationships, and the moon is making a trine to Jupiter. That trine to Jupiter, particularly powerful if you're in Australasia or East Asia, or at the beginning of the day. But it's still, we've got moon in Scorpio, Jupiter in Cancer, both in water signs, and I think that does give you the ability to relate to people pretty well, and I think that you come over as being someone who is pleasant, someone who can be related to, and you're able to see the way in which you and others are connected. You can focus on what perhaps you have in common, and really try to think about that today. Now, maybe later in the day and into tomorrow, things might become a little more complicated, because the moon is making an opposition to Uranus. So that moon opposition Uranus, I don't think you have to worry about it particularly today. Well, maybe at the end of the day, moon opposition Uranus. I mean, it's that moon opposition Uranus, it does involve Venus. So actually thinking about it, the best way of dealing with people is to be friendly and straightforward, to see what people have in common, but also just think ahead to how people might disagree with one another. Where those fault lines might be. Try to think about that. I don't think you need to obsess about it, but you need to have a bit of vision here, and I think that is going to be important. But don't worry about it too much. When Venus moves into Pisces, I think that is going to give a real boost to your sensitivity and to your ability to understand other people, and I think it's going to help your social life. But I'll be talking about Venus in Pisces in greater detail when I do your horoscope for tomorrow, for Tuesday. But overall, I think it looks like being a good day, a reasonable day certainly. I do take into account other people. There is a last quarter moon. That this last quarter moon could be relevant. I mean, you've got the sun in Aquarius, square moon in Scorpio. So with this last quarter moon, that might say something about what you're trying to achieve and what you perceive are the obstacles. And that last quarter moon, it may occur to you that there are some people you have to take with you. In other words, you have to convince them that you are on the right path. It's not enough to just sort of to make up your mind and tell everyone you're going to do this when not everyone is convinced. And maybe this last quarter moon is a reminder that not everyone agrees with you, that there are people that have to be persuaded. And it's a challenge, this last quarter moon. But if you really want to see things through to a successful completion, then there may be a little more persuading that is required. So maybe you have to talk to someone, persuade them that you are right, and perhaps listen to alternative views, and then maybe that gives you a chance to find some kind of agreement. So that is, I think, a constructive way of using this last quarter moon. Gemini. Mercury is in Pisces, and it is making a semi-sextile to Pluto. Arguably, this is the main aspect of the day. So we think again about what Mercury in Pisces is about. And with Mercury in Pisces, it's certainly about what you want to achieve. You may not be able to achieve everything you want, but certainly it's important to you. And Gemini, do think about your ambitions. Think about what you want to achieve. Well, I think it's a case of between now and it's April, isn't it? I mean, that's a long time, because Mercury stays in Pisces for 2 months. Now, yes, that's a long time. It's a long time for Mercury to stay in a sign which is fallen. Traditionally, Mercury doesn't really work very well in Pisces. On the other hand, Mercury is ruled by Jupiter. Jupiter's in Cancer. Jupiter's in its exaltation in Cancer. So when I say Mercury is ruled by Jupiter, that is because Mercury is in Pisces and Jupiter rules Pisces. And so the next couple of months, I believe, could be quite useful, and it does give you an opportunity to hit some of your targets. But it's not always going to be easy, and there's certainly plenty of scope for getting confused, and you have to watch your emotions. I mean, it's good to be emotional up to a point, but you might get over emotional, and because you get over emotional, you might make a mistake. So that is a way in which Mercury in Pisces could work. Now, the semi-sextile to Pluto might be about you just having a realization which, to begin with, is not necessarily easy. It's Pluto in Aquarius. Pluto in Aquarius is quite an ideas-orientated Pluto. You're thinking about what is possible, but also there's a philosophical and spiritual sense to it, and it relates to the world at large. And the question is, are your actions in accordance with your fundamental beliefs and your changing beliefs? And weirdly, there might be a moral dimension to it. Now that might sound strange. You don't think of Mercury as being necessarily the most ethical of the 12 signs. Mercury does what it needs to do, and Mercury can move from one place to another. It can move from one moral position to another. But it just might occur to you over the day that something might not be right. Now, it might be right, might not be right because it is just wrong, plain wrong. It's just immoral, whatever. Or it upsets your ethical standards. Or it just might not be quite in accord with the times in which we live. Because you can see the way things are changing. And so the question is, are your ambitions in accord with a changing world? And it might occur to you that they're not. And it's good that you have that realization. Pluto is telling you that something else is going on. So rather than give up on your plans, to think that, well, this is completely hopeless, instead take into account what Pluto is telling you. Take into account how the world is changing. Then you can start to fine-tune your plans, and that's going to be a good thing. So the Mercury semi-sextile Pluto is really about you being able to integrate sort of a higher level force, which, like it or not, you're becoming aware of, and coming up with a set of plans and ideas which is going to be consistent with a future, a future which could be troubling. It's going to be troubling for all of us, but you can keep yourself relevant if you handle this Mercury semi-sextile Pluto in the right way. And that means that you mustn't get sort of caught up in chaotic thinking. I mean, you could with Mercury in Pisces, but it's unnecessary. Remember, but we've also got the moon in Scorpio, and the moon in Scorpio, not the greatest place for the moon to be from a Gemini perspective, but with that moon in Scorpio, you have a chance to really create some order. Perhaps that's part of a problem with Mercury in Pisces. With Mercury in Pisces, you may be just aware of the chaos all around you. I'm looking around me at the chaos. It's a good thing that this camera is only looking in one direction. If you really saw the chaos in which I was living, it is indeed shocking. I'm probably the most chaotic person I've ever met, in some respects. But anyway, those are my problems. And with the moon in Scorpio, you have a chance to make sure that everything really is in order and is making sense. And it is a last quarter moon. We've got the sun in Aquarius square the moon in Scorpio. And so what that means, Gemini, is that, you can have all sorts of ideas, plans. They can be crazily ambitious, they can be inspirational, but do they make sense? Can they be brought down to earth? Are they in keeping with you and maybe your health? And when I say health, I mean your spiritual health, your physical health, your emotional health. So you have to, perhaps with this last quarter moon, just make a few changes, and perhaps it's about bringing yourself down to earth, ever so slightly. You don't have to completely bring yourself down to earth. You've still got to be, you still can be very inspired, but a bit of grounding at the moment can go a long way. Cancer. Arguably, we have a grand trine in water signs, because we've got the moon is making a trine to Jupiter at the beginning of the day, and then it's moving towards a trine to Saturn. So got moon in Scorpio, got Saturn in Pisces, and Jupiter in Cancer. And this grand trine allows you to feel pretty good about yourself. Certainly better about you feel better about yourself than many other people. So certainly in a relative sense, you're feeling good about yourself. And this grand trine in water signs just allows you to understand, what is happening. Very few people understand what's going on, because things are just happening at such a rapid pace. But Cancer, I think you kind of get it. And with the moon moving through Scorpio, you know what you are, what you're capable of doing, and maybe even you know that you have to give it your best shot. You have to do something which really is in accord with who you are. And I think with this grand trine in water, just really allows things to flow. Now, the moon does make a square to the sun. And so that means the moon in Scorpio making a square to the sun in Aquarius. And not every Cancerian is going to feel this, but you have to think about what is the last quarter moon about. The last quarter moon is really calling time on the lunar cycle. So we had a new moon at 28 degrees Capricorn about 3 weeks ago. We had that new moon. The lunar cycle has developed. Hopefully you've made the most of it, and now it's coming to an end with that last quarter moon. And in a week's time, there'll be a new moon. And so the question is, what now? What do you need to do in this last week or so of the lunar cycle? And it might be, Cancer, that there are certain things you've been taking too seriously. You may have regarded certain aspects of your life as being really difficult, requiring a lot of contemplation. You don't want to take risks, and you might have felt at times a bit stuck. But the moon square the sun is saying, well, you've got to start to be yourself. I mean, I think that moon square sun is telling you've got to take responsibility for what's going on, for sure, but you've got to be yourself. And you mustn't take things too seriously, because if you take things too seriously, if you regard everything as a threat, everything as a problem, then where is the real Cancer? And that moon in Scorpio square the sun, well, it might be square the sun, but moon in Scorpio is wanting attention, and that's kind of you wanting attention, not wanting attention from other people, but wanting attention from yourself. And it's about you recognizing what you can do. Sure, you realize what the problems are, what the risks are, but the moon square sun is asking you to think about what is your individual path, how are you going to develop this path. And the moon is making a trine to Jupiter, it's making a trine to Saturn, and so this grand trine is about you taking something which may start off as being difficult, even emotionally difficult, and then realizing that things actually can flow, that things can move, and you can really get a great sense of who you are, what you can do, and what you can achieve in this last week of the lunar cycle. So I know that last quarter moon doesn't sound great. It sounds like the end of something, maybe a bit sad, but for you, I think this last quarter moon is something very fortunate. It can give you the impetus to really make the most of your many talents. Leo, things are, well, they're probably pretty static at the moment. I'm not saying they're always going to be static, but it's a day when there's not a huge amount going on. Astrologically, we're rather light on exact aspects, and the moon is still moving through Scorpio. So while the moon is in Scorpio, you just feel probably quite protective of yourself and your space, maybe your family as well. You're very aware of what is your world, what is your domain, and why should you move beyond this domain? Why should you take risks? What is the point? And that's looking at things from a quite sort of negative perspective. On the other hand, the moon is making a trine to Jupiter. It's making a trine to Saturn. So we have a sort of a grand trine in water signs. And so in your own way, you can cover quite a lot of emotional ground. Now, I'm not telling you that you should just float around in an emotional soup. That's not a desirable outcome. But instead you should make some effort to explore your feelings, perhaps explore your limitations, and be ready to consider the possibility that there are other things going on, other things requiring your attention. And this links with the fact that we've got a last quarter moon. So we've got the moon in Scorpio making a square to the sun in Aquarius. So this last quarter moon might say a great deal about relationships and the sort of relative power of different people in your life. With the sun in Aquarius, it is a time when you have to consider other people. I mean, after all, the Aquarius is your opposite sign. You're not completely alone, and so that's been a theme with the sun in Aquarius, plus all these other planets in Aquarius. But then the moon comes along and makes a square to the sun. And so what is that about? And it might be about how you consider certain relationships in your life, probably the closer relationships. Where is the limit? Where is the boundary? You can get on very well with someone, but to what extent do they have an influence on the fundamental you? And it might be about that sort of borderland between a relationship and family, for example. How close do you want to get to someone? To what extent can someone be trusted? And that might be what the last quarter moon is about, and having to make a decision about trust. And it can also work in terms of members of your family. Are they members of your family, or are they just particular relationships? You get on with someone or you don't get on with them. And so think about the people who are closest to you. And it might be with this last quarter moon that it occurs to you that a few changes are required. And I'm not talking about trivial changes. Maybe a relationship has to get sort of deeper and more intense, but maybe certain relationships are just starting to get too close, and you need a bit of space. So that sounds somewhat negative, but I'm not trying to be negative at all. I think this last quarter moon can be very valuable as far as telling you about other people and making decisions about your own boundaries. On a slightly different note, and a more positive note, at the moment, Leo, you are quite clever, and your cleverness is focused on perhaps one or two areas. Something just seems to work. And it may work in your own eyes. You see it working. You do something, and you can see that you're really getting it together. And it might be a time to be talking about how clever you are, not in a way that is boastful, but you're letting yourself know and everyone else know that you have got something to offer, and it's very definite. It's very particular. It's perhaps something you've learnt over time, or it just might be a natural talent, natural skill, and now might be your chance to really bring it out into the open. Virgo. Well, I hope you're enjoying Mercury's sign change. Mercury is now to about 5 degrees Pisces, and Mercury's going to stay in Pisces for a long time because of its retrograde motion. I think Mercury stays in Pisces for the next couple of months. I don't think it leaves Pisces until sometime in April. And so, with Mercury in Pisces, you're certainly having to, I think, consider the external world. You you understand that you can't necessarily do everything, on your own. You're going to need help, and if you try to do things completely on your own, well, that is not necessarily going to work out. And Mercury is moving towards a conjunction of a North Node, and with Mercury moving towards a conjunction of a North Node, I think that you're starting to recognize, who can help you, and also how you can be useful, how you can be helpful. So you do not have to do things on your own, and I don't think you should be doing things on your own. I mean, it does depend, but other people, can matter, and from a relationship perspective, Mercury moving through Pisces is probably fortunate, although you have to remember with Mercury moving through Pisces that Mercury is in an emotional it's in a fairly emotional sign. It's in a water sign, and in general, Virgos, it depends on the Virgo, but in general, Virgos, they're not particularly emotional people. Feelings are not your prime way of dealing with the world, and so when you're dealing with an emotional environment, it can be confusing, and you might get caught out, particularly if you're dealing with people who are very emotional, because people who understand their own feelings can be fairly manipulative. Now, Mercury is making a semi-sextile to Pluto. So Pluto is telling you something, and it's reminding you that you can't take things too far. You would like to just drift. Part of you does like to drift, would like to drift, because Mercury is in Pisces. You may not be entirely comfortable with it, but you have to accept that this is where Mercury is. But the semi-sextile to Pluto is just reminding you of something else. And Pluto is now in Aquarius. It's been in Aquarius for some time, since the end of 2024, and now it maybe matters. And Pluto is perhaps about the way you are structuring your life, the way you're organizing yourself. And as Pluto moves through Aquarius, Virgo, you've perhaps been realizing that things can't necessarily go on as they have done in the past. You might have been doing the same thing for years on end, and now you realize it's got to change. And so there is the conflict. Part of you just wants to float free, but another part of you is saying, well, hold on, this isn't good enough. Something has to change. And if we try to be constructive about it, with Mercury in Pisces, well, Mercury in Pisces, there is always a problem with Mercury in Pisces, because Mercury in Pisces can just be too chaotic. You don't know where you're going. But there's a contradiction here, because it's the right thing to do, to sort of float free and to explore the emotional side of things. But then Pluto is then providing some assistance. It's providing some help. It's basically saying, yeah, sure, go out to sea. I mean, go out to sea in an emotional sense. Embrace the chaos. But at the same time, don't forget me. Don't forget Pluto. Don't forget that underlying structure. You've got to hold on to it, and you just keep holding on to it, and it will make sure that you get through. So you've got to kind of incorporate Pluto and what Pluto means in order to be able to make the crossing. And when I talk about making the crossing, I'm talking about, perhaps crossing this ocean. Mercury in Pisces represents an ocean. Remember, Mercury is going to be in Pisces for 2 months. So things are going to be complicated, perhaps. It's going to be difficult to know what's going on. The map might be getting rather soggy. It might be falling apart. But of course, I know people don't use maps anymore because they've got GPS, but maybe the GPS satellites aren't working too well. And so Pluto is there to help you. And just bear in mind that fundamental structure that you need to live your life by, and it's a changing structure, but you need that change in order to progress, to make the most of this period while Mercury is moving through Pisces. So, I mean, I know that sounds a bit sort of abstract and complicated, but I'm just hoping you sort of get my meaning. You get my message. Libra. Venus is absolutely on the brink of changing sign. So noon New York time, we have got Venus at, 29 degrees 6 Aquarius, getting ready to move into Pisces. And so, this is an important change. And I don't want to spend sort of too much time or any time really talking about what it means for Venus to be in Pisces. Rather, we should be thinking about that last degree of Aquarius. And last degrees are often seen as being unfortunate. I don't fully get that. I'm not saying you're going to have a bad day just because the moon is in the last degree of Aquarius. But because it's the last degree, and also because we've got a last quarter moon, is that some Librans might just feel that today, Monday, is an ending. I know that Monday is supposed to be the beginning of a week. Okay, some people say that Sunday is the beginning of a week, but it seems logical for Monday to be the beginning of a week. So you really might feel that something is reaching its end, and hopefully you regard it as being a quite natural end. Things can't just go on forever. I mean, that's just not possible. And you're thinking, hopefully, about what you've achieved over the last few weeks, and I'm hoping that you're aware now that there is something you can do which you can do very well, that is a fundamental expression of who you are. In other words, that you are making the most of all of these Aquarian planets, and now that you have understood what you can do, the next challenge is to perhaps implement it and create the right kind of structure for your future success. I mean, that might require a bit of work over the next few weeks, but I don't think it's anything that you can't handle. And so that's one side of what's going on today. I think in a general sense, Libra, you're going to be pretty good at dealing with people. I think that you come over as someone who is optimistic, that you have a certain vision, and that you can appreciate other people's vision. And so, Libra, if you want to bring people together, I think that you can have some success. I'm not saying you're going to have spectacular success, but I think it's going to be good enough. And also, the moon is in Scorpio. It's making a trine to Jupiter. Now, that trine to Jupiter is going to be particularly powerful in Australia or New Zealand. If you're in the Americas, it may be more of a feature at the beginning of the day. But then, if you're in the Americas, you may be starting to pick up on a trine between the Moon and Saturn. So Moon trine Saturn, Moon trine Jupiter. Wherever you are, you're going to feel that to some extent. And I think that this trine relationship, in fact, it's a grand trine really, because you've got Moon in Scorpio, Jupiter in Cancer, Saturn in Pisces. I think it's just going to be helpful. I think that it's a good time to be exploring your aims, your desires, and if you're working today and tomorrow, I think that you can be pretty successful. I mean, not dramatically successful. Okay, maybe it is dramatically successful, but I shouldn't think it's a real time for fireworks. But I think you can make solid progress, and you can hold to what you believe in. And I think that your fundamental vision should be picked up upon. People will realize that that you are going in the right direction, and if you have a belief about how things should be done, then don't be shy. I think if you quietly express your views, I think that people will listen, and I don't think there'll be much in your way. Scorpio. The moon is moving through late Scorpio, and it's making a trine to Jupiter. It's making a trine to Saturn. Beginning of the day, moon trine Jupiter. End of the day, moon trine Saturn. So, we have got a grand trine in water signs. So from a Scorpio view, I think that is pretty fortunate. I think that you're someone who can just go with the flow. It's all very easy, and there's no real resistance. So if you want something to happen, Scorpio, then I think you should be able to just make it happen. I think it's going to be really pretty straightforward. So that's something that you can work on, and additionally, you're beginning to realize that all of these, you've had all these planets in Aquarius, and Venus is about to leave Aquarius, and these planets in Aquarius, have been maybe quite stabilizing for you. You've decided that some things are important, and you want to keep them that way. But this moon in Scorpio, it does make a square to the sun. So you've got moon in Scorpio square the sun in Aquarius, and it is the last quarter moon, and it occurs to you that something maybe has to change, and that perhaps it's time for you to be more honest about who you are. I think from many Scorpios have been keeping things secret. You felt that maybe no one wanted to know, no one cared, or maybe you felt that if you were to reveal too much, you might compromise yourself. But with this moon in Scorpio square the sun in Aquarius, I think it's a time to be more open and be clear about what it is that you represent. Especially now that you've got this grand trine in water signs. Moon trine Jupiter, that is a fortunate aspect, particularly fortunate if you're in Australia and New Zealand when you get it at full power. But moon trine Saturn is about getting things together, creating structures, making sure that everything is in order, and it's all very easy. And you're perhaps also beginning to realize that, hey, Mercury is in Pisces. So Mercury in Pisces is I think a good placement for Mercury, certainly from a Scorpio viewpoint. And you're perhaps realizing that some things can be fun, that you can afford to be playful, but at the same time you kind of don't want to be playful because Mercury is semi-sextile Pluto. So Pluto in Aquarius, that is a serious force, and Pluto is making you think very carefully about who you are, where you have come from, what your roots are, what your thoughts about your family and your history. And that's great. I think that Pluto certainly represents a time of discovery, really discovering who you are at a very fundamental level. But it's being challenged by Mercury. And I think that Mercury in Pisces, semi-sextile Pluto in Aquarius, is just asking you to lighten up. And I think you can afford to lighten up. And I think that this process of lightening up is going to intensify tomorrow, when Venus moves into Pisces, and that's certainly something I will be discussing in my horoscope for Tuesday. Sagittarius. The moon is in Scorpio, still in Scorpio. It's going to be in Sagittarius soon. It's going to be in Sagittarius tomorrow. So, with the moon in Scorpio, there may be things that you're not quite ready to reveal, but you're almost there. And the moon in Scorpio is making a trine to Jupiter, especially at the beginning of the days, because Jupiter is your ruler, and that this trine between moon in Scorpio and Jupiter in Cancer is probably about your inner world, and what is happening in your inner world. And I think quite a lot is going on. There's a lot of thinking and feeling as well, and you are taking things quite seriously, more seriously perhaps than you normally do. I mean, you are a Sagittarius, and Sagittarius has got a reputation for being fairly light-hearted. I think that is a reputation which is possibly exaggerated, but still, it's this moon in Scorpio trine Jupiter in Cancer. It's just about a different. It's about a different way of being, and you're reminded that Jupiter in Cancer is it's telling you to take things more seriously and to look below the surface, and that is something you can do, and you're not really ready to reveal much, but that is going to change when the moon moves into Sagittarius, which is going to happen very soon, and continuing on, what is going on in your world, in your perhaps your private world, you're quite inspired. I think that your mind at the moment is really very active. You're thinking about lots of different things, and you might have some realizations. Something just might occur to you, and it might just seem absolutely obvious, and it hadn't. You're amazed. You're amazed. You kind of didn't make the realization earlier, but it is becoming clear, and you can see things now that you just couldn't see maybe a few days ago. And so if you're feeling inspired, that might mean that very soon you're going to be able to discuss this inspiration, and you're going to actually create some action. But as far as today is concerned, you feel sort of half inspired. The inspiration is there, but is the opportunity there as well? No, it's not. But I think it's just a question of waiting. And I think that when the moon moves into Sagittarius, you're going to have a chance to really be yourself, and that's certainly something to be looking forward to. Now, we do have a last quarter moon. I mean, the last quarter moon is really the theme of this video, and so we got the moon in Scorpio square the sun in Aquarius, and it probably supports what I've already said. So with the sun in Aquarius, it's probably a time in general when Sagittarians can be quite open, when there are things you normally would say, you would point out. But that moon in Scorpio is just reminding you that some things should be kept to yourself. You can't be completely open and honest. I know I'm kind of repeating myself there, but the last quarter moon is just reminding you that there's just something else, and it may be something from your unconscious, something, moon in Scorpio, something coming from sort of quite a deep place, and it's there, and it's challenging. And so you'd like things to be straightforward. You'd like things to be simple. And this last quarter moon is just reminding you that there's something that is a complicating factor. And if we're talking about hidden things, it may be something that's being hidden not by you, but perhaps by someone else. And the challenge here with this last quarter moon might be to uncover the truth, whatever that truth might be. And of course, uncovering the truth is very often the fundamental mission of the average Sagittarian. Capricorn. Well, Saturn is in very late Pisces now. It's at, 2932 Pisces, and it's close to Skeet. It's, I think, 14 arc minutes to Skeet. So Skeet is a fixed star connected with accidents, shipwrecks, things going wrong, perhaps water damage, and one could look at Saturn in the worst possible light. Now, for example, if I was doing weekly horoscopes rather than daily horoscopes, it would probably be easier to focus on Saturn being in the last degree, of Pisces. And I know that many of you watching this regard the last degree of a sign as being especially unfortunate. I don't think there's any reason why the last degree of a sign should be unfortunate, but in terms of Pisces, we do have this Skeet issue, and so Capricorn, this just might be a time when things connected with water should be avoided. We know that water is all over the place. I mean, I think with Saturn on Skeet, we've been having storms and rains in a lot of parts of the world. I know in Europe things have been difficult. I know there's been sort of major storms in the Iberian Peninsula, and certainly I've heard that in Portugal it has been pretty grim. So that might be relating to Saturn and Skeet, but Saturn is your ruler, and so your relationship to water and plumbing and doing things close to water should be reviewed. I don't think it's not a time to be taking risks with water, or to be playing around with plumbing with Saturn in this position on Skeet. So there is a warning there, and Saturn is going to be on Skeet, not just today, but it's going to be on Skeet for the next few days. It's already been on Skeet for some time, and so I don't know how much you're thinking about this. Now, with Saturn on Skeet, this might make you more sensitive to disasters. So when you see disasters reported in the news, it might have a big impact on you, and you might always also be thinking about the world and how the world is progressing, and it just looks grim. I think that can be a Capricorn thing. Many Capricorns really do think that things were just so much better in the past. There is sort of a historic side to the Capricorn personality. Things that are old and traditional are better for the new, and things never get better. They always get worse. And with Saturn on Skeet, that is certainly something that you're thinking about. But there's no need to be too negative. I mean, the Moon is making a trine to Jupiter. It's also making a trine to Saturn. So we've kind of got a grand trine in water signs: Moon in Scorpio, trine Jupiter in Cancer, trine Saturn in Pisces. So this does mean, Capricorn, that in spite of your reservations, your ability to be with people is pretty good. And if there's something you want to say, something you want to offer, then it should all be very straightforward. So if you're thinking about other people and your relationship with them, you might kind of be a little bit negative. You might think that there's no point in trying, that it's just going to be too much effort. But in fact, I don't think it's going to be much effort at all. So in spite of your reservations, I think that at the moment, Capricorn, you have a a sort of a natural social skill. Yeah, you might not feel the skill, but it's there. It's very real, and people are going to appreciate you, and people are going to appreciate, whatever it is that you have to offer. And I think actually you've got quite a lot to offer, and you have what have you got to offer? Emotional support, maybe, but I'm thinking more about sort of practical advice. And if you know something, even if you don't think you know it very well, I think that knowledge can be useful to everyone. Aquarius, last quarter moon, and last quarter moon, I think that is important. This is a time when you've had a lot of planets in Aquarius, and these planets are now leaving Aquarius. We've already had Mercury leaving Aquarius. Now Mercury's in Pisces. Venus is on the point of leaving Aquarius. But still, you've got the Sun in Aquarius. You've got Mars in Aquarius, Pluto in Aquarius. And yeah, Venus is still there today. And the last quarter moon is telling you, or it's asking you, well, what are you doing about it? How are you making the most of all of these planets in your sign? And the moon is in Scorpio. It's making a square to the sun in Aquarius, and I think it's trying to motivate you. It's asking you to really think about what you've done and what you have not done, and part of its motivational strategy is putting some pressure on you. It is the last quarter moon. The lunar cycle is about to end. There isn't much runway left. Just a week left before we've got the new moon. Okay, you might say, oh well, there's a new moon in Aquarius, but it's a new moon at the very end of Aquarius. So it's not perhaps a usual Aquarius new moon, and so it does seem to me, Aquarius, that there's just something that needs to be done. And I think that this last quarter moon is really telling you, asking you, what is it? Perhaps you've delayed it. Perhaps you haven't finished something. And that last quarter moon is saying, well, you have to sort it out like now, certainly over the next week. But ideally, today, Monday, would be a good time to get working on it. And so that's something that you really need to focus on, Aquarius. Okay, there's nothing you should do, but if we just look at the astrological symbolism, I do think that is important. And yeah, sure, you can prepare for the new moon in Aquarius, beginning of the Chinese New Year, and you could argue, okay, you shouldn't be doing anything because it's just the very end of the Chinese year, so why should you do anything? Why not just wait until the new moon? Well, we're not quite there yet, so I'm hoping that you're going to really be able to make the most of it all, and don't assume that everything is fine, and don't assume that other people know what they're doing. It's quite possible that some people don't know what they're doing, and you then need to remind them that perhaps they're getting it wrong. So don't be afraid of intervening and expressing your opinions. You have definite opinions, and over the next I don't know, certainly over the next 24 hours, today, Monday, perhaps into Tuesday a bit, the moon is making a trine to Saturn. And I think that moon trine Saturn is going to allow you to assert yourself, and also to get yourself together. So the moon, having made that square to the sun, makes a trine to it starts moving towards a trine to Saturn, and there are many ways in which you can get yourself together. Perhaps this is particularly the case if there is something going on connected with money. So maybe there's something of a financial nature that is half resolved, but is not completely resolved. And over the next day or two, you have a real chance to sort it out. Pisces. There is a grand trine, kind of. I mean, it's not an exact grand trine, but it's good enough. We've got the moon in Scorpio, trine Jupiter, trine Saturn. So the moon trines Jupiter. Okay, that kind of takes place at the beginning of the day. End of the day into tomorrow, got moon trine Saturn. So, this grand trine, it's in water signs. You are a water sign. And so I think that this grand trine should allow you to really get yourself together and to get things moving. And, you might be of the view that you can't get things moving. It's all just so difficult, but it's not difficult at all. And I think that this grand trine should give you the vision and the motivation to really get things together, to get things on track. And they might be off track. Maybe you need to get things back on the rails. I don't know, but I think it's definitely a positive. And that moon trine Saturn coming up. Saturn is still in Pisces, still there. And it's about to change sign. It changes sign on Thursday, but it's still there, and the moon is making a trine to Saturn, and so that trine can give you new insights. I mean, there's a lot that you're aware of. There's a lot that you're becoming aware of, but that moon trine Saturn, things can really click, and you could argue that the moon, having made that trine to Jupiter, is kind of bringing things together, because you've got Jupiter and Saturn, these two principles. Jupiter is a principle of freedom and all the things you can do, and then Saturn is a principle of restriction and discipline, and the moon allows it to come together. And this may work in quite an inspired way. And it may come through a revelation, and there is a sense of revelation today, Pisces. Your mind is on good form, and you're thinking about lots of different things. I mean, helped by the fact that Mercury, the communication planet, is now in Pisces. It is in your sign, and so something might occur to you, and it just might be amazing, and it suddenly makes sense. And now you can start to think about what you're going to do, what action are you going to take. And this might also be shown in the way you're able to communicate. So if you're talking, you're telling people about things, your excitement may be very obvious. And some people need excitement. Right now things for some people might seem a little bit flat, a little bit boring. There are things going on, but people aren't quite sure what is going on. And if you are excited about something, Pisces, then I think you need to talk about it, because people are looking for inspiration. They're looking for something new, and I think, Pisces, that you are in a position to provide it. So those are my forecasts for the 12 signs, and I now want to turn to the I Ching. So I asked the question, what is Monday going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was hexagram number 63, which is after completion. So after completion gives us a sense that something has been done, something has been finished. So in that sense, it sounds quite good. I mean, it's always good to have finished something. We've crossed a river. But the I Ching is not entirely positive about this hexagram, because it's really indicating that having done something, having made the transition, we may have kind of gone, out of a frying pan into the fire, that we have reached a situation where things aren't great and we don't really know what's going on. And because we've changed the rules, we've changed the location, so we don't have a map, and so we might be lost. and things can easily disintegrate into chaos. Now, we do have two moving lines here. The bottom line moves, and then the fifth line from the bottom moves. So the bottom line is about braking. It's about, you've got, I don't know, some kind of wagon like moving into a river and it quickly getting bogged down. But it's not a bad line because you're running into trouble quickly. You know, it's bad if you run into trouble when you're halfway across the river. So it's about realizing that you can stop. So I know that this hexagram is about after completion, but maybe we don't necessarily see it through because at a pretty early stage, we realize that it's not going to work. And so if you start to think that something isn't working, that you start to run into trouble, then just stop what you're doing. There's absolutely no humiliation here. It's absolutely the right thing to do. Then the fifth line moves. And the fifth line is talking about sacrifices and how sacrifices are judged. So it's comparing an extravagant sacrifice with something very simple. And you have a sort of reminder that it's like with the Bible. I can't remember. Oh God, I should know better. But it's like Christ saying, someone who is poor and they contribute just a very small amount of money. It's far better in God's eyes from someone who just ostentatiously makes a huge contribution or a huge charitable gift. It's what you can afford. And so that's kind of like, with the sacrifices. It's not about ostentation. It's about what you can do. It's about, being simple, keeping things simple. And so that is about the right approach, particularly if we're dealing with after completion. We're trying to make a transition, but we don't want to do it in a way that is extravagant. We don't want to draw adverse attention to ourselves, and we have to do what we can do. We can't go any further. And so if we are modest, that is absolutely the right approach. And talking about modesty, two moving lines, what hexagram do we move to? We move to modesty. And so that's telling you about today. Today is not about ostentation. We don't have to feel that we have to achieve a huge amount. After completion, we might want to sort of boldly cross the river, do whatever we can, but that's not the right approach. The approach is to really keep it simple and do what we can. It's not a time for boasting, and we might be worried that if we keep it simple and we don't boast, we won't get any attention. We'll get attention. If we're true to ourselves, then what can go wrong? And finally, I want to go back to the astrology, and I just want to quickly look at the last quarter moon. So here is the chart for the last quarter moon. It happens at 12:43 p.m. London time, so around lunchtime in London. So last quarter moon will happen sort of in the morning if you're in the Americas, relatively early in the morning. Won't happen until this evening, or maybe even early Tuesday morning if you're in New Zealand, I think. So one way or another, we've got this last quarter moon. And so this moon, we've got the moon is at 20 degrees 46 Scorpio, and the sun is at 20 degrees 46 Aquarius. So, this last quarter moon, as I've been saying, throughout this video, is perhaps, our final opportunity to get something together, within this lunar cycle. And, we're aware of what we have accomplished, what we have achieved, but we're also aware of what still needs to be done. And perhaps quite a lot still needs to be done. And so, there could be, a bit of a rush, or we might feel that rush. But then we have to break down this last quarter moon. What is it about? Well, we've got the sun in Aquarius square the moon in Scorpio. And so if we want to see things through, we have to acknowledge that sun in Aquarius. However we see that sun in Aquarius, we might have a concept, we might have an idea, we might have a theory about how something can be done, but we also have to think about that moon in Scorpio. I mean, moon in Scorpio is a very emotional planet. The moon you might regard the moon as a satellite, and so if we want to see things through, we possibly have to consider things from a human perspective. We've got to consider human feelings. Human feelings may not be logical, they may not be rational, but we still have to take them into account. Otherwise, nothing is going to get done. But maybe with this last quarter moon, it could also be about a realization that we've done what we can and we can't really do any more. Especially as this last quarter moon, relates to the Chinese New Year. Although I really don't know anything about Chinese astrology, I do know that this last period before the Chinese New Year can be a time of just wrapping things up. It's a time of endings. You don't start anything new, and maybe that's how you should see the last quarter moon. It is it is the last week, of the Chinese New Year. So that's certainly a way of looking at it, and one might also want to consider its structure in the chart. I mean, it's kind of tied in with the Venus-Uranus square. So at the time of the last quarter moon, Venus is pretty close to the square of Uranus, and this Venus square Uranus, it's important. Uranus is still going pretty slowly. I mean, it wasn't so long ago that Uranus went stationary direct. I mean, it was less than a week ago that Uranus went stationary direct. So Uranus is still very relevant. That Venus square Uranus is still very relevant, and we may then see something of a challenge here. We can see how difficult things are, and maybe the last quarter moon will realize how problematic the world is, and it could be about drama. There is a dramatic feel to this last quarter moon, as I'll be showing you in a minute when we look at its midpoint structure, and again we've kind of got a bit of a T-square here, you could say. We've got a very wide T-square, but you've got Sun conjunct Venus, and this is square Uranus. This is square the Moon, and so there is something going on. There is a degree of instability here, and it's a fixed T-square. So when you've got a fixed T-square, everyone is holding on tightly to something, and then just something has to give. It doesn't bend. It just breaks. Now, this particular last quarter moon chart is set for London. I mean, I don't think I want to go on and on about what's going on in the UK, but I just saw the news. Keir Starmer's chief of staff has just resigned. What's his name? McSweeney. Then anyway, he's resigned, and this is happening just before the last quarter moon. Something had to give, and at the time of his resignation, Venus was exactly on the midheaven. So with Venus on the midheaven, that's kind of interesting. I mean, how do you see Venus? I mean, Venus is perhaps a universal significator of women, maybe women in politics. But Venus may just be tied in with Uranus. So at the time of this last quarter moon, Uranus Uranus is square the midheaven in London. So I think that this last quarter moon, certainly in terms of Britain and the British government, is going to have quite a dramatic impact. And then there is the 90-degree dial. So looking at the 90-degree dial, here it is. So because it's a 90-degree dial, the sun and the moon are going to be shown to be in the same place, because conjunctions, squares and oppositions are shown as all as conjunctions. So what midpoints is it on? So the midpoints that it's on, the key midpoints is this last quarter moon, it's aspecting the Venus-Mars midpoint, because the Venus-Mars midpoint is at 21 degrees Aquarius, so it's pretty close to the Venus-Mars midpoint, but also it's on the Mars-Uranus midpoint. So there's Mars. It's on the Mars-Uranus midpoint, on the Mars-Venus midpoint. So on the Mars-Uranus midpoint, that could be quite dramatic, this last quarter moon on the Mars-Uranus midpoint. Mars-Uranus represents tension. It can be aggressive. It can be about accidents. It can be about something exploding and something really coming into being, which perhaps is quite unexpected. It's also on the Venus-Mars midpoint. So this last quarter moon, for some of us, this Venus-Mars midpoint, maybe a last chance to get someone's attention. I mean, Venus-Mars is about attractiveness, it can be about attractiveness, and how people try to get other people's attention, and it can be quite a seductive thing. And the Sun has been conjunct the Venus-Mars midpoint for a long time. It's still conjunct the Venus-Mars midpoint, so the moon is just picking up on the fact that the Sun is a Venus-Mars on the Venus-Mars midpoint. So yeah, so there could be something quite seductive as well as violent and destructive about this last quarter moon. So thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, I'd be super grateful if you were to subscribe. If you want to buy me a coffee, there's a link in the description, and I will talk to you again tomorrow.